Hello humans, it's just Martine, and today we're going to be talking about my February reading stats. February was a bit of a crazy month, mainly because I did this insane project where I started a new book every day. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check it out right here. And in addition, it was the end of Squashette series, and so it also looks like very different from my January reading and all of those things. I read less. I'm not going to say a sane amount because it's still like a lot, but it is less. It is less, you know? I did some other things with my time, including like listening to music instead of only listening to audiobooks, for example. So hardcore competitive readathon Martine took a month off, you know, and she'll be back soon, maybe. We'll just have to see. So I have a lot of stats and fun things to share with you today. If you want to know how much money I saved by using my library this month, you should stay tuned until later on in the video. That's personally always my favorite, so it's a little something to look forward to for me. But without further ado, we're going to start talking about it. If I'm looking this way, it's because I'm looking at my computer. But to you, it'll look like I'm looking at whatever graphs I put there, when there is a graph. But let's start by talking about the amount that I read. Firstly, how many books did I read in the month of February? I read 30, so one more than the number of days. I'm quite pleased with that. I read a total of 9,069 pages, which made my average pages per day 312.72. And let me tell you, that's 72% of a page every day. One of the best parts. For hours spent reading, I read for 102.915 hours, which is about 40 hours less than I spent reading in January. That listening time really adds up, which meant that per day I was reading an average of 3.5 hours. For eyeball versus earball, I read with my eyeballs every single day in February, 100% of the days, 29 out of 29. Audiobooks are a different story. I read with my earballs for 5 out of 29 days, which is 17.24%. I was burnt out on audiobooks from Squashette series, so the audiobooks that I did read this month were the end of Squashette series, and then I was like, no. And on average, it took me 5.77 days to read a book. And if you were wondering, that's actually less than January, which is crazy because of my start a book challenge. Because with that, I felt like my main takeaway was I would start a book and then take forever to finish it because I was focused on all the other books I was in the middle of. But apparently, on average, it took less time. So I don't know. Okay, let's get into some general book information about the books that I read. We'll start with genre. I read from 11 genres. My largest genre was mystery. That makes total sense to me. 1, because I read a lot of mysteries at the end of Squashette series. 2, because last year my most read genre was mystery. The next after that is sci-fi. And those are also 2 of my biggest categories for the year in general. I'm pleased to say that the amount of fantasy I read this year went way down. I only read 2 fantasy books compared to the 10 that I read last month. This month, I do actually think the fiction versus nonfiction is more interesting. I only read 1 nonfiction book last month, so I excluded the graph, but this is what it looks like. 90% fiction, 10% nonfiction. I did read 3 nonfiction books in February. I don't really care how much fiction versus nonfiction I read, but it is interesting to look at, I think. Next, I'm going to talk about book size. My shortest book was Enola Holmes and the Boy in Buttons, which was 21 pages. It was technically a short story. And my longest book was Royal Assassin at 693 pages. So my average pages per book was 302.3. If you look at my graph, you can see that small and medium books dominated, but had about the same number of books, actually exactly the same number of books, both small and medium. I read 14 of them. I didn't read any chunky books this month, which is of note. That's any book over 700 pages. Nothing hit that for me, but I was glad to include at least 2 books between 500 and 700 pages. Star ratings, I just feel like it went better in the month of February, and maybe that's not actually true, but you know what is true is that in January, I didn't read a single 5-star book, and in February, I did read 2 5-star books. So I just really want to shout out the fact that I actually finally got a 5-star in the year of 2024. It feels a lot better than having no 5 stars yet. You know, my average rating was 3.7. And most of my books, per usual, were between 4 and 3.5 stars. For series versus standalone, you can definitely tell that I still read lots of series this month. 63.3% of the books that I read were parts of series. This is partially because the first week was still Squashette series, and then also partially because after that I was still in the middle of books from series that I hadn't been able to finish during Squashette series. So here I am, still reading sequels. It is what it is. But at least I did read more standalones in the month of January, where I read 1. Instead, standalones made up about a third of my graph, so about 10. For author status, about 2/3 of them were authors that I've read from before. That goes hand in hand with reading books that are parts of series. If I've read the first book in a series, then I've read from the author before. For type of publishing, per usual, largely traditionally published. I always have trouble distinguishing between indie and self-published, so take those two with a grain of salt. But according to this, I had 2 self-published books, 1 independently published book. It's not bad. Could be worse. For publication date, they're largely backlist books, so that's any book published in 2022 or before. 13.3% of my reads were from 2023, and unlike January, I had absolutely no books from 2024. I think it's a bit ironic to have 2024 reads in January, which is like the very beginning. How are there already books out that you're reading? But in February, once it's a whole month in, you're like, no, nothing new to read. And then for age range, I read a perfect 1/2 adult books. I read 9 children's books, which makes up about 30% of my reads for the month of February. That was a lot of Squash That series and then also Magic Treehouse read along. I guess I read Magic Treehouse for Squash That series too. And then I did have a few, meaning 6, YA books. For format, I largely relied on ebooks, with 60% of my reads being an ebook. 26.7% of my reads were physical reads, which is way higher than in January. I did read 1 book with both eyeballs and earballs, depending on how I was feeling, actually at the same time. That was Royal Assassin. It's because I binged the last 8 hours of it in one day and my brain was hurting at the end, so I needed a little help. And then 10% of my reads were audiobook, which is way down from January, and around where I like it to be, honestly. Where did I acquire these books, you might ask? Well, about 2/3 of them were from Libby. There were also a couple physical library reads from my library at school. That was 6.7% of my graph, which is the exact same percentage as the number of owned ebooks that I read. And then 20% of my reads for the month were owned, which feels great. Interestingly, those 2 physical library books were the only 2 physical library books that I've read so far this year. Most of the owned books that I've read this year were read in the month of February, 6 out of 8 of them. Now, let's talk about money and goals. I bought 0 books, so I spent $0, 0 cents on books in the month of February. Nice. But then my library. How much money did it save me? Well, I'll tell you. It's a bit of a bummer. It's less than January, but that's because I read way too much in January. So I'm still impressed and proud to say that I saved $317.83 using my library in the month of February. Ka-ching. Which brings my total savings up for the whole year to $863.51. And finally, let's touch on some goals. My Goodreads goal this year was 52 books. I am now sitting at 73 books, so I am at 140% of my goal. I will not be increasing my goal. It always sits at 52. You know, sometimes it's fun to say you hit 700% of your goal by the end of the year. I also had a goal to read at least 24 owned books. So far, I have read 8 out of these 24, which is exactly a third, 33.3% of the goal, well on track. I also had a goal to read at least 24 owned ebooks in the year. So far, I've read 6, which is a perfect quarter, 25% of the goal, also well on track. Finally, one of the things that I'm trying to do is use my iPad to read, because if I read enough on my iPad, I feel like I can justify spending fun money to get a Kindle Paperwhite. And so I'm keeping track of how much I am using my iPad. I did use it less, I would say, in the month of February because Kindle jail was a real thing and there were only a few very large books that were stuck on there, and it made it so that I couldn't put anything new on there, and that made it hard to read iPad books, but I think that's fair. So I technically read 5.5 books on my iPad because Royal Assassin, I did read it on my iPad, but I also listened to part of it, so I'm not gonna give myself a whole book for that. You know, it's 5.5, which means that 5.5 out of the 18 ebooks that I read in the month of February were on my iPad. This means that 30.5%, a little less than a third of my books were read that way. It also means that 5.5 out of the 30 books I read all month were read on my iPad, which means that out of all the books I read this month, 18.3% were read that way. Not quite 20, but not nothing. I'll give myself that. So with all that said, I feel like I'm in a really good place with my reading so far this year. I'm excited to see what March has in store for me. If you liked this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below how was your reading month in March, and drop me a little shamrock emoji if you're still sticking around till the end of this video, and subscribe for more bookish and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!